He was just an old black man on a park bench, quiet, polite, sipping his coffee. But when a young cop decided to make him a target, he didn't realize who he was messing with. In seconds, the officer reached for power. In days, the city would be on trial. Because that man was Elijah Brooks, former federal advisor, and the spark behind a storm Charleston would never forget. Dear viewer, what you are about to witness is not just a story. It is a powerful testament to the quiet power and pursuit of justice in places most people ignore. If this is your first time here, I warmly invite you to share where you are watching in the comments below. And if stories like this move you, challenge you, or make you think, consider subscribing and clicking the bell icon. We share voices that deserve to be heard every day. Thank you for being here. Now, let's get into the story. There are moments in life that change everything, not because of what was said, but because of who dared to say nothing and still made the world stop. It began in the hushed corners of Madison Square Park, a peaceful pocket of New York City often overlooked by those too busy chasing deadlines to notice the quiet wisdom that sometimes sits right in front of them. That morning, the city was humming with its usual chaos. Sirens, crosswalks blinking, conversations overlapping in every language. But on one bench, beneath an old elm tree shedding its golden leaves, sat a man who would unknowingly bring it all to a halt. Malcolm Trent looked like any other elderly black man enjoying the early fall air. Dressed in a clean gray overcoat, a navy scarf wrapped neatly around his neck, and polished shoes that hinted at decades of discipline, he sipped his coffee slowly, eyes scanning the horizon like he was remembering something no one else could see. To a stranger, he might appear retired, maybe a former teacher or pastor. But Malcolm was neither. He was the architect of reforms that had reshaped entire systems, the advisor behind policies presidents had signed, the quiet force who had dismantled corruption one courtroom at a time. Not that anyone knew it, not the young officer who spotted him. Officer Ryan Delaney was new to the force and eager to prove himself. He'd been told to watch for loitering, to keep the park clear. He'd also been raised on stories that taught him to see black stillness as suspicious. And Malcolm, unmoving, serene, didn't sit right in his rookie-trained eyes. Ryan approached with confidence bred of ignorance. He saw the man, not the history. He saw silence, not power. And within seconds, he made the mistake that would cost him everything. "Sir," Ryan called, his voice clipped, commanding. "Can I ask what you're doing here?" Malcolm turned, slowly, politely. "Just enjoying the morning." "Do you have ID on you?" Ryan asked. Malcolm raised an eyebrow. "Is that a requirement to sit on a bench now?" That question, so calm and so dangerous in its clarity, flicked something in Ryan. Embarrassment, defensiveness, maybe even fear. But instead of de-escalating, he escalated, demanded ID, reached for his radio, raised his voice. Passers-by slowed. Phones emerged. Something felt off. The man wasn't resisting. He wasn't agitated. He wasn't doing anything but sitting. And yet the officer looked ready to make it something more. Ryan reached for Malcolm's arm. Not forcefully, but with the assumption that control was his to take. Malcolm stood, slow and measured. "I suggest you think very carefully about your next move, officer," he said, eyes locking with Ryan's. There was no threat in his tone, only truth. A truth Ryan didn't yet understand. Around them, the air thickened. I'm going to need to see what's in your bag, Ryan pushed. Malcolm tilted his head. You should call your supervisor. Sir, don't make this difficult. I'm not the one making it difficult. And then it happened. Ryan reached again, and the moment broke. People stepped closer. A woman shouted, "Why are you harassing him?" Another began filming. A man nearby dialed 911, and Malcolm, still composed, still dignified, did nothing. He just stood there, not resisting, not reacting, just watching a young man drown in his own assumptions. By the time the supervising officer arrived, the crowd had doubled. What should have been a quiet interaction was now a public spectacle. Body cams were rolling. Eyewitnesses were live streaming. Ryan tried to explain himself. He refused to show ID. He was being evasive. The sergeant turned to Malcolm. Sir, I'm sorry for the disturbance. Can I ask your name? Malcolm smiled faintly. Doctor, Malcolm Trent. You might want to run it. The sergeant did. His face shifted instantly. Silence swallowed the scene. Ryan's confusion turned to dread as the words popped up on the screen. Malcolm Trent, Senior Strategic Counsel, United States Department of Justice. Everything changed in that instant. Not because Malcolm raised his voice. He didn't. Not because he threatened legal action. He hadn't. But because the system had just turned on its own, exposing one of its own flaws in full daylight. The sergeant stepped aside. Ryan stammered, apologized. Malcolm didn't flinch. He didn't need to. His presence had already done the work. He picked up his coffee, adjusted his scarf, and sat back down. And the entire city felt it. Something had shifted. What happened next would ripple far beyond the park, beyond Ryan's suspension, beyond the footage that would go viral within hours. It would lead to hearings, reforms, and a reckoning that had been long overdue. But in that first moment, there was only a bench, a man, and a question. Do you know who you're talking to? And more importantly, do you know who you're really protecting? The park would never forget, nor would the city. Because Malcolm Trent wasn't just another black man on a bench. He was the storm they never saw coming. And this was just the beginning. The rain had just begun to fall in Baton Rouge when Officer Derek Wallace spotted the figure on the sidewalk. An older black man in a tailored suit, walking calmly beneath the streetlights, his briefcase tucked neatly under one arm. There was nothing unusual about the scene, except for one thing. Wallace didn't like the way the man walked, as if he belonged, as if he had nothing to fear. Wallace pulled over slowly, the cruiser's headlights cutting through the mist, casting long shadows across the man's path. The officer stepped out, hand already resting on his holstered sidearm. Hey, you there, he barked. Let's see some ID. The man turned slowly, his expression unreadable. Is there a reason you're stopping me, officer? Wallace smirked. You fit the description. Description of what? The man asked calmly. Wallace didn't answer. He stepped closer, now within reach. Don't make this harder than it has to be. The man set down his briefcase, his hands raised in a peaceful gesture. My name is Isaiah Freeman. I'm on my way home. But Wallace wasn't listening. He yanked Freeman's arms behind his back and slammed on the cuffs. The older man didn't resist, but a crowd had started to form nearby. Restaurant goers, students, people sheltering under awnings. What's he done? Someone shouted. Nothing, Freeman called out, even as he was forced into the back of the cruiser. But maybe now, you'll find out who I am. The ride to the precinct was tense. Wallace kept glancing into the rearview mirror, But Freeman said nothing further. His silence wasn't submission. It was anticipation. When they arrived, Wallace dragged Freeman through booking like a trophy, ignoring the curious stares of fellow officers. It wasn't until Freeman handed over his ID that the first tremor of doubt crept into Wallace's mind. The sergeant behind the desk read the name. His eyes went wide. "You arrested Isaiah Freeman?" "Yeah." "Why?" Wallace asked. The sergeant stood up slowly, the color draining from his face. "You just arrested the newly appointed federal oversight director for Louisiana's entire law enforcement system." The room went silent. Someone dropped a pen. Wallace's smirk faded, replaced by a flicker of confusion, then disbelief. Freeman turned to face him, the steel in his gaze unmistakable. "I told you. Now you'll find out who I am." News spread like wildfire. By morning, Freeman's wrongful arrest was front-page news. Every major outlet ran the story. Respected reformer, detained and humiliated by a patrol officer for walking while black. Protesters gathered by noon. The mayor's office released a statement by 3. By sunset, the precinct was under federal review. And Wallace, he was suspended pending investigation. His record splashed across headlines, every past complaint now under a magnifying glass. But Isaiah Freeman wasn't angry. He was resolute. This wasn't about revenge. This was the moment he'd been preparing for all along. Not just to reform a system, but to reveal it, expose it, and rebuild it from the ground up. The arrest didn't break him. It gave him the stage. And Isaiah Freeman was just getting started. Rain clung to the sidewalks of Charleston like forgotten sorrow. The evening sky was a slate-colored curtain hanging over the city, heavy and unmoving. Streetlights flickered, halos of orange glowing against the encroaching dusk. On a quiet corner of Jefferson and King, Elijah Brooks sat on a wooden park bench, the one he visited every evening like clockwork. His presence was as much a fixture as the bench itself. A silent man in his late 70s, always dressed sharp, always alone. He had lived through generations of history, some carved into statues, others buried in unmarked graves. He carried it in his stillness, in the way he folded his hands and tilted his chin just slightly skyward, as if watching a world that refused to look back at him. Officer Darren Cole was young, brash, and wore his badge like a weapon. He had patrolled Charleston for just under 2 years, yet he walked the streets with the swagger of authority too often confused with righteousness. That night, his car crawled past the corner, headlights slicing through the drizzle, and then abruptly stopped. Elijah didn't look up. He didn't need to. He knew the sound of judgment long before it spoke. Cole stepped out. His boots splashed through shallow puddles. He approached with the clipped pace of someone who believed they were approaching a problem. "Sir," he said flatly, "I'm going to need you to move along." Elijah turned his head slowly, his eyes meeting the officer's. Calm, unyielding. And why would that be? "This park closes at dusk," Cole snapped. "Loitering after hours is against city ordinance." "Interesting," Elijah said, "because I've been sitting on this bench every evening for the past 12 years. Same time, same place." Cole shifted his weight, already irritated. "Then maybe it's time you change your routine. I said move." It wasn't just the words. It was the tone, the undercurrent of presumption, the assumption that an old black man sitting alone could only mean trouble. Elijah's silence and response seemed to escalate the moment. Cole stepped closer. "Do you have identification?" Elijah raised an eyebrow. I wasn't aware I needed a passport to sit on a public bench. That was all it took. Cole reached for his cuffs. The world snapped from rain-muted gray to harsh blue and red in a flash. Within moments, Elijah Brooks, who had done nothing more than occupy a bench his taxes paid for, was forced onto his knees, wrists wrenched behind his back, face pressed to the wet concrete. Across the street, a woman paused in front of a diner window. Her name was Dana Walters, and she had lived in Charleston her whole life. Her mouth parted in disbelief. She saw no resistance, only the rough treatment of a man who moved slower than time. She pulled out her phone. She pressed record. Inside the diner, a man stirred from a corner booth. He wore a raincoat too large for his frame and a baseball cap pulled low. He had been following Officer Cole for weeks. His name was Nathaniel Chambers. What Cole didn't know, what the city didn't yet know, was that Nathaniel wasn't just some quiet traveler. He was the Deputy Attorney General for Civil Rights. Chambers watched, unmoving. Every instinct screamed at him to intervene, but he didn't. Not yet. Because sometimes silence wasn't cowardice. Sometimes it was preparation, evidence, proof. Elijah didn't yell, didn't cry. As the cuffs bit into his wrists and the cold soaked into his bones, he thought of every time he'd been silenced before. As a boy in Alabama, kicked off a bus for sitting too close to the front. As a young man in Detroit, denied a job despite degrees and dignity. As a father, teaching his son how not to die during a routine traffic stop. He had survived decades of storms, and this was just another. When the backup unit arrived, they didn't ask questions. They saw Cole. They saw an old man in cuffs, and that was enough. Dana's video had already hit social media. It took 30 minutes before it began to circulate, 45 before a local news outlet picked it up. Within an hour, it was on every screen in the city. The image was stark. An elderly man face down in the rain, the glint of cuffs on his wrists, a young officer looming above him like judgment incarnate. Calls began to flood the department. Who was this man? Why was he arrested? What threat did he pose? Why did it feel like Charleston had just witnessed a lynching without rope? But Elijah didn't speak. Not yet. He was released without charges, without apology, without a glance. They told him it was a misunderstanding. He said nothing. He simply picked up his hat from the sidewalk, shook the water from its brim, and walked away. The city thought that would be the end of it. It wasn't. Because silence can be a blade, a whisper before the thunder. And behind that silence, a storm was building. One name was about to change everything. Elijah Brooks. And the city of Charleston had no idea who he really was. There are moments in history when power quietly shifts hands without warning, without a declaration, without even a raised voice. And in that moment, as Officer Darren Cole smirked beside the patrol car in Clearwater Park, the weight of that shift was already in motion. Unseen, unstoppable, and coming for everything he thought he controlled. Because the man he had handcuffed, shoved, and humiliated wasn't some frail old man. He was Elijah Brooks, and Darren had just declared war on the wrong kind of quiet. In the hours following the park incident, Elijah sat alone in the sterile concrete of the holding cell, not defeated, but calculating. Across the city, whispers began to ripple through the legal corridors, not just about the incident, but about who had witnessed it. Nathaniel Chambers, Deputy Attorney General, hadn't just seen it happen. He had documented it, and he had already begun drafting the first inquiry. Back at the precinct, tension was starting to simmer. Officers weren't used to feeling watched, but suddenly, something was off. Reporters started calling. Civil rights lawyers showed up unannounced. A leak had made its way to a local journalist, Quentin Voss, who had published a breaking report. Elderly man assaulted by police. Federal witness present. The story exploded. Darren Cole, still clueless to the depth of what he'd done, sat in the break room, bragging to fellow officers about putting the geezer in his place. But by the time he returned to his desk, there was a sealed envelope waiting. Internal Affairs. Mandatory review. He tore it open, cocky, until his face drained of color. Nathaniel had moved fast. Within 24 hours of the incident, he triggered a federal oversight committee to look into patterns of abuse within the Charleston Police Department. He hadn't made any public statements yet. He didn't need to. His silence had become a drumbeat, strategic, measured, and deadly. Elijah was released without charges, but he didn't return home. He returned to action. He called a meeting with 4 retired judges, 2 former police chiefs, and a pair of black community elders who had fought similar battles in the 60s and 70s. They met in the back room of a community center, the walls filled with faded photos of marches and vigils. What happened wasn't just about him, Elijah told them. It was about all of them. And it was time the city remembered what real accountability looked like. Meanwhile, Quentin Voss's article was picked up by national outlets, CNN, MSNBC. Even Fox News ran a segment questioning whether Charleston PD was enforcing law and order or upholding systemic bias. Darren Cole's name became a trending topic. The police department scrambled to control the narrative. They failed. When Nathaniel finally did speak publicly, he stood in front of the federal building, flanked by faith leaders and legal scholars, and delivered his statement like a quiet thunderclap. When a citizen, any citizen, is humiliated without cause, the Constitution does not blink. And when the state ignores that, the federal government will not. He never mentioned Darren Cole by name. He didn't have to. By then, everyone already knew. Behind the scenes, Elijah and Nathaniel worked together like chess masters. Every move methodical, every press leak calculated. They weren't just seeking justice for one incident. They were digging into officer records, resurrecting buried complaints, reviewing body cam footage, and filing subpoenas that sent chills through City Hall. Darren's bravado turned into paranoia. He hired a lawyer. He shut down his social media. But nothing stopped the tide. Protesters began gathering daily outside the precinct, holding signs that read, "We saw," "He's not alone," and "You messed with a legend." The image of Elijah sitting calmly on the park bench became an emblem, printed on t-shirts, shared on digital billboards, and plastered across downtown. Elijah had no desire for revenge, but he did believe in truth. So when a local high school invited him to speak, he agreed. Standing in front of students, many of whom had already learned to fear the police, Elijah didn't talk about what had been done to him. He talked about legacy, about the fight to live with dignity, and about never letting fear make your spine fold. A week later, Officer Cole was officially suspended pending federal investigation. But the real blow came when the city council voted, by a 7-1 margin, to approve the creation of an independent civilian review board, something that had been rejected 5 times in the last decade. The difference this time? Elijah Brooks. The man who sat silently in the park now stood at the center of a movement. And Darren Cole? He was no longer just the officer in question. He had become the face of a system's worst nightmare, a system where impunity was the norm and silence its favorite weapon. But Elijah had turned that silence into sound, and the whole city was listening. The morning of the public hearing arrived with the kind of heaviness that blanketed the entire city. Charleston felt subdued, like it was collectively holding its breath. The courthouse steps, once symbols of silent routine, now trembled beneath the weight of history demanding to be made. Inside, the air was electric. Reporters lined the aisles. Activists filled every available seat. Outside, a growing crowd gathered with placards and silent prayers, waiting to hear how a single wrongful arrest had unraveled the illusion of justice they had long suspected was cracked. Elijah Brooks sat quietly at the center of it all. No longer the man with a paper sack on a park bench. No longer invisible. He wore a dark tailored suit, not flashy, not loud, just enough to reflect who he was now allowed to be in the public eye. A dignified man who had been tested and emerged unshaken. Beside him sat Nathaniel Chambers, Deputy Attorney General, and, in many ways, the architect of the reckoning now underway. Their presence alone was a statement. This was no longer about one act of bias. This was about a system. Judge Avery Maddox, presiding over the inquiry, tapped her gavel gently but firmly. "This hearing is now in session," she announced. Her voice was calm, but everyone in the room could sense the gravity hanging beneath every syllable. "We are here today to review not only the conduct of Officers Darren Cole and his superiors, but to assess the broader implications of their actions and the culture that allowed them." The first to testify was Officer Cole. His uniform was pressed, his eyes hollow. Under oath, his tone danced between arrogance and carefully rehearsed remorse. The individual appeared to be loitering. He matched the description we were given. My intention was not malicious. But when pressed by Chambers about why he ignored protocol, why he reached for force before inquiry, why he never called for backup or logged the incident properly, his words began to crumble. "Did you know who Mr. Elijah Brooks was at the time?" Chambers asked coldly. "No, sir," Cole answered. Chambers didn't blink. "But you knew he was a black man sitting alone in a park?" A silence settled. Cole nodded. And that was enough. Cole shifted. The courtroom shifted. The weight of implication had finally found its shape. Witness after witness took the stand. A mother whose son had been stopped 5 times walking home from work. A teacher who had watched her students targeted on their lunch breaks. An elderly man who said he stopped sitting outside his own building because police made him feel like a suspect in his own skin. None of them spoke Elijah's name directly, but all of them echoed his story. Then came Elijah's turn. The room leaned forward. "I'm not here for revenge," Elijah began, his voice deep, calm, and full of that quiet power that had once been mistaken for frailty. "I'm here for clarity, for acknowledgement. I sat on a bench because my legs were tired. I stood up because someone threatened my dignity. I didn't say anything at first, because I've spent a lifetime watching what happens to people who do." He paused, letting the silence breathe. But something shifted that day, and it wasn't just about me. It was about a badge that thought it had the right to erase someone, about a department that treats silence as consent, about a city that's been swallowing stories like mine for decades. Judge Maddox looked at him, her expression unreadable but alert. "And what do you want this hearing to achieve, Mr. Brooks?" Elijah's eyes didn't waver. I want the city to see itself, and I want it to decide who it wants to be from this point forward. There was no applause, just silence, the kind that follows a truth too sharp to ignore. The proceedings continued for hours. Documents were entered into evidence, internal emails revealing patterns of targeting, body cam footage mysteriously missing, complaints filed and then buried. Nathaniel Chambers laid out the connections with surgical precision. Names of complicit commanders, patterns of falsified reports, data showing disproportionate stops, arrests, and the racial trends no one could explain away anymore. It wasn't just Darren Cole on trial now. It was Charleston itself. By the end of the day, the temperature in the courthouse had changed. Even those who had entered skeptical, older council members, retired law enforcement officers in the back rows, now sat straighter, grimmer. Not because they had suddenly found compassion, but because the evidence no longer allowed them the luxury of denial. Judge Maddox recessed the hearing until the following day. But as people filed out of the chamber, no one was talking about adjournments. They were talking about change, what it would look like, who might resist it, and who would be willing to stand for it. Outside, the crowd had tripled. People gathered around speakers, broadcasting the hearing in real time. Young people live streamed their reactions. A group of elders, many of whom had known Elijah from his earlier days as an educator, a mentor, a neighbor, stood hand in hand, murmuring prayers not of mourning, but of awakening. As Elijah stepped onto the courthouse steps, the people didn't cheer. They didn't chant. They simply looked at him with a kind of quiet reverence. One man nodded to him and whispered, "You're not just telling your story anymore. You're telling ours." And Elijah nodded back, not as a hero, not as a victim, but as a witness to a truth too long buried. A truth that, for the first time in Charleston's recent history, was finally being spoken aloud. The city had been placed on trial. And no matter the outcome of the hearings, one thing was now unmistakably clear. The verdict wouldn't just be about one officer, one man, or even one case. It would be about the soul of the city and whether it had the courage to reckon with itself. Charleston never returned to what it was before that storm of truth broke across its streets. Something had shifted permanently, and the weight of it lived not in headlines or official statements, but in the small, almost invisible details. The glances exchanged between neighbors, the questions students began asking their teachers, the way officers paused a beat longer before approaching someone. Elijah Brooks never asked for a monument, yet the city gave him one. Not the kind carved in marble, but the kind etched into daily life. A policy renamed, a patrol code rewritten, a town hall that now welcomed voices long ignored. His story was no longer just his. It had become part of the city's memory, a compass pointing toward what it could no longer pretend not to see. There was a bench in Clearwater Park, freshly restored. It looked like any other at first glance. Simple wood, black iron frame. But the brass plaque on its backrest read, "In honor of those who never stopped watching, even when the world looked away." People sat there now, with purpose. Some came to reflect, some to mourn, others simply to witness. The bench had held silence once. Now, it held truth. Elijah continued his work quietly. He never chased the spotlight. When asked why he didn't run for office or accept any of the TV interview offers, he would smile and say, "I don't need to speak louder. I just needed to be heard once. His dignity had never needed amplification. It had only needed recognition. Deputy Attorney General Nathaniel Chambers pushed forward with structural reforms in Charleston and beyond. Internal affairs saw a complete overhaul. Transparency measures once dismissed as idealistic were now standard. And Officer Darren Cole, no longer an officer. His dismissal marked not a scapegoating, but a signal. The system could no longer shield those who weaponized it against the innocent. But the most enduring legacy came in the hearts of the people. Children in classrooms now learned about Elijah Brooks as part of local history, not as a victim, but as a symbol of peaceful power. And when a young boy once asked him what he had done to become important, Elijah answered gently, "I didn't try to be important. I just tried to stay human, even when the world forgot I was." His legacy couldn't be erased because it had never been about just one man. It had always been about every person who had been told they didn't belong, every quiet strength mistaken for weakness, every truth buried beneath uniforms and silence. Elijah didn't just change the course of his city, he reminded it who it could be. And that kind of legacy, once lit, doesn't fade. It spreads. In the quiet park where it all began, where a simple bench once held a man wrongly judged by his appearance, a story unfolded that the entire nation would never forget. Elijah Brooks was not a politician, not a protester with a megaphone, not a viral activist, but he carried something more powerful: unwavering dignity. The moment Officer Darren Cole targeted him with aggression and arrogance, believing he was just another elderly black man to push around, the fuse was lit on a reckoning no one saw coming. Because Elijah wasn't just any man. He was a deeply respected former federal advisor, a silent builder of justice who had spent decades shaping the very system that now threatened him. The confrontation wasn't the end, it was the ignition. What followed was a powerful unraveling of lies, corruption, and racial profiling deeply embedded in Charleston's police department. But more than that, it was a reclaiming of voice, of truth, of identity. Elijah never needed to raise his voice. His calm, steady presence, paired with the quiet but firm support of Deputy Attorney General Nathaniel Chambers, shook the very foundation of a system that for too long had stood unquestioned. We watched as silence turned into reform, as shame turned into accountability, and as one act of prejudice became the spark for collective justice. Elijah didn't seek revenge. He sought restoration. And because of that, his story became a mirror held up to an entire nation. So, what do we learn from Elijah Brooks? We learn that power doesn't always wear a uniform or hold a title. Sometimes it sits quietly in a park, wearing a worn coat, watching a world that's been unfair for too long. We learn that real change doesn't always begin with noise. It begins with presence. It begins with someone refusing to be erased. In our own lives, this story asks us to do something simple but profound. Look again. Look again at the person you might dismiss. Speak again when silence feels safer. Stand again when others sit down. Because justice isn't a system, it's a choice. One we make every day in the ways we treat people, challenge bias, and demand better. If Elijah's story moved you, challenged you, or reminded you of the quiet strength we all carry, we ask you to support us by subscribing to our channel. Every voice we amplify here matters. Every story we share brings us closer to the world we all deserve. Don't miss what comes next, because the fight for dignity, justice, and truth is just getting started. Thank you for standing with us